to Mr. Ives, and I invite you to address us on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Keddy, and respected fathers and brethren. It's an honor to be able to participate in this way and to speak on a topic and on an individual who has been very near and dear to my head and my heart, Thomas Chalmers. On April 27th, 1847, just a month before Thomas Chalmers died, he wrote to a good friend and supporter in America, "I wish to communicate what to me is the most joyful event in my life. I have been intent for 30 years on the completion of a territorial experiment, and I have now to bless God for the consummation of it." During those 30 years, Chalmers had become Scotland's premier preacher, celebrated by such figures as William Wilberforce, who once exclaimed, "The world is wild about Chalmers." As you know, he rose to prominence in the Church of Scotland and taught a generation of divinity students at the University of St. Andrews and the University of Edinburgh. While in the latter post, he successfully spearheaded an effort to raise funds for 220 new church buildings in poor working class areas of Scotland. Having championed the spiritual independence of the church against state intrusion, in 1843, he courageously led more than 400 ministers out of the establishment in what would eventually be called the Disruption. He then provided masterful administrative guidance of the new fledgling denomination, the Free Church of Scotland, setting it on a sound financial footing. It was not without reason, then, that Karl Marx dubbed him the Arch Parson. But this opening quote we just shared above shows us where his great ambition really lay, that is, to complete a territorial experiment. This lecture tonight, my afternoon, retells the story of Chalmers' home missionary efforts in the slums of the Westport, Edinburgh, and then turns to explain how he advocated his territorial model. So first, some backstory. This final chapter in Chalmers' evangelical career ends where it began. Having first rediscovered and practiced the parish model in idyllic rural Kilmany, I hope I'm not butchering that, Fifeshire, after his conversion to evangelicalism in 1812, and having dedicated many years to promoting it, he returned once again to practicing the parish as a means to Christianize the land. Quote, "Yet such do I hold to the efficacy of the method with the divine blessing, that perhaps as the concluding act of my public life, I shall make the effort to exemplify what as yet I have only expounded." At the age of 64, the renowned evangelical churchman threw himself into a final effort to transplant Kilmany, that is, the communal parish ideal, into the slums of industrial Britain. Or to use a popular 19th century Isaianic metaphor, he went to make the desert blossom as the rose. In many respects, this experiment would be a reiteration of the same model he deployed in St. John's and Glasgow from 1819 to 23, and in the Water of Leith of Edinburgh from 1833 to 36. As before, Chalmers was not interested in conducting this missionary experiment in middle class or upper class communities of Scotland. Rather, his great concern was for the economically blighted and morally abandoned wastes of home heathenism. And by the 1840s, the plight of urban industrial Scotland had gone from bad to worse. Both civil and ecclesiastical voices united to decry the lamentable state of the masses, economically, morally, and spiritually. But this particular experiment of Chalmers would be somewhat different. From one angle, the disruption severed the kirk from all state support, a tremendous sacrifice he and his fellow evangelicals made in the cause of spiritual independence. Nevertheless, he could now pursue his project unhindered by the complexities of church patronage and an uncooperative government bureaucracy. Chalmers' final experiment formally began with a series of lectures in June and July of 1844, printed in The Witness, managed by Free Churchman Hugh Miller. In them, he rebuked British Christendom's abandonment of its working class poor, restated his cherished principles of territorialism, expressed his determination to create 66 new working class churches, and summoned a band of volunteers to join the effort. Specifically, he proposed the formation of societies comprising 20 volunteers each. Each society would adopt a needy working class district. That district would in turn be divided into 20 sections, or what he called proportions, of 20 contiguous households each, and each of the 20 society members would be assigned to one of the proportions. It would be that member's duty to pay weekly visits to its residents, familiarizing himself with its families. His job would be to ingratiate himself with them, that he might effectually promote their spiritual and temporal well-being. Being an explicitly missionary endeavor, the emphasis was on spiritual care. And so the great aim of the visitor would be to get people into church. Yet they would seek to raise the outward condition of the population through education. They would spearhead the formation of a school for its children, hire a school teacher, and recruit students who would receive a quality, heavily subsidized education. And they would, of course, facilitate the establishment of public ordinances on the Sabbath, hiring a full-time missionary. While Chalmers himself would work to establish a Free Church of Scotland territorial church, this scheme was overtly ecumenical. Dissenters and free churchmen would collaborate. Each society would work towards the formation of a congregation belonging to its respective denomination. On the one hand, this method would stifle petty jealousies and the acrimony of the voluntary controversy of the 1830s, and yet at the same time, the scheme would cultivate a healthy fraternal competition. All would strive to outdo each other in love and good deeds for Scotland's poor and neglected. Quote, "Woe betide the hindmost. Let us all set forth. Let us strive to outrun each other in this good work. See who will get congregations formed soonest and who will form most." End quote. But Chalmers himself would lead by example. To make his experiment truly worthwhile, he picked arguably the worst cesspool of industrialized Scotland that he could find, the Westport of Edinburgh. This was the district that had not long before been the scene of the horrific butchery of Burke and Hare, a sewer of almost unimaginable squalor, disease, illiteracy, and crime. There seemed to be no better place to demonstrate the viability of the urban parish without an establishment. By late July, he had recruited 10 volunteers, 7 of whom were middle-class men from outside the Westport and 3 from within it. Together with James Ewan, a dissenting missionary with the Edinburgh City Mission, Chalmers divided the district into 20 proportions of 100 contiguous households each. By January, he had enlisted the services of more than 20 workers, thus giving each proportion at least 1, if not 2, devoted laborers. A survey his agents conducted that September in the Westport only confirmed the dire need. Of 411 families and a gross population of 2,000, only 45 families belonged to a Protestant church, a tenth of the population, and 70 families were Roman Catholics. Consequently, 296 households had absolutely no church connection whatsoever, while most could hear the church bells of several services. A quarter of the entire population were paupers, that is, those on the public roll for poor relief, and a full quarter were given to thievery and prostitution. There were more than 400 children in the Westport, yet only 122 attended school. But these agents witnessed more than disturbing statistics in a ledger. William Hanna wrote that it was no uncommon thing for William Tasker, the eventual minister of the Westport, when first making his rounds, quote, to find from 20 to 30 men, women, and children huddled together in one putrid dwelling, lying indiscriminately on the floor, waiting the return of the bearer of some well-concocted begging letter or the coming on of that darkness under which they might sally out to earn by fair means or by foul the purchase money of renewed debauchery. Upon one occasion, he entered a tenement with from 12 to 20 apartments where every human being, man and woman, were so drunk they could not hear their own squalid infants crying in vain to them for food. He purchased some bread for the children, and entering a few minutes afterwards a neighboring dram shop or tavern, he found a half-drunk mother driving a bargain for more whiskey with the very bread which her famishing children should have been eating. He went once to a funeral and found the assembled company all so drunk around the corpse that he had to go and beg some neighbors to come and carry the coffin to the grave, end quote. The bottom had evidently fallen out in the Westport. But every week, this small band of volunteer philanthropists walked through their proportions, dealing mainly in the one thing needful. As Chalmers advised, they read scripture, distributed religious literature, prayed with the inhabitants, and urged them to attend the services on the Sabbath. Then they would convene on Saturday evenings to compare notes. Having strongly dissuaded them from offering financial assistance on their visits, he yet encouraged them to be sensitive to real-life living conditions and needs. They could certainly assist those unemployed in finding work, and they could advocate for them with local authorities to clamp down on public nuisances that fostered waste and vice. And while distributing the bread of life, they sought to arouse interest and commitment in the coming district school. They would make education available to the poorest of the poor because all children have the innate potential for academic achievement given the opportunity. The minutes of the Westport Local Society capture the reports of the district visitors in the opening years of its operation and provide a window into their weekly efforts. Frequently, the visitors would share about prayer meetings they had established and how they fared. Often they would convey something of their spiritual instructions. Quote, in going round one Sabbath, Mr. Wilson found one family incivil, but proceeded to read the Bible, spoke pointedly, and in prayer alluded to their spiritual condition, which he believes to have been the cause of their dryness. The next family he saw were quite the opposite, end quote. A later report was more uplifting. Quote, Mr. Wilson had many encouragements in his district. In one family, there are evident marks of a work of grace, especially in the case of the mother, concerning whom he is entitled to speak in a decided manner. And though he cannot say the same of the father, there are considerable hopes of him also. They both attend the Sabbath services regularly, and the husband seems much affected with the anxious state of his wife. The children attend school and are doing remarkably well. He might also mention the case of a man, Alexander, who has made a decided sacrifice rather than accept of employment, which, though very advantageous in a pecuniary point of view, required him to violate the Sabbath, end quote. They often noted in their interactions with Romanists, and frequently the comments were positive. Quote, Tracts are cheerfully received and perused by Roman Catholics. And in some instances, they do not dislike or discourage religious conversations founded on a passage of Scripture. They even come to the district prayer meetings and the Sabbath public service, end quote. But they did at times meet resistance, such as one fellow that claimed that he, like many others, quote, though formerly in the practice of attending church on Sabbath, yet having imbibed infidel principles from books which he perused, no longer frequented the house of God, end quote. They also lamented their encounters with drunkenness and its collateral damage and deliberated as to the best methods to attack the vice. Yet ultimately, they knew the only effectual remedy against it seemed to be the more diligent and prayerful use of the means of grace. Soon, the Westport Local Society secured a schoolroom. It was a fitting emblem of the district it would serve. Hannah again writes, quote, it lay at the end of the very close down which Burke and Hare and his associates decoyed their unconscious victims. Fronting the den in which those horrid murders were committed stood an old deserted tannery, whose upper store loft, approached from without by a flight of projecting wooden stairs, was selected as affording the best accommodation which the neighborhood could supply. Low-roofed and roughly floored, its raw, unplastered walls pierced at irregular intervals with windows and unshapely form, it had little either of the scholastic or of the ecclesiastical in its aspect, end quote. Into this dingy hovel of a schoolhouse, Chalmers called the inhabitants of the Westport to an opening public informational meeting on November 6, 1844. In it, he shared that the society offered each genuinely Westport family a subsidized quality education for their children. Yet he made clear that each family must contribute a certain amount towards the cost of the schooling. Indeed, the society's whole experiment would fail in proportion to the degree in which residents did not respond to these voluntary efforts, cooperate, and become eventual net contributors to the success of their own community. The school then opened the following week on November 11th with 121 students between day and evening classes. The students pursued the subjects of reading, writing, natural science, geography, and the Bible, while the more proficient could further pursue English grammar, Latin, and mathematics. Sabbath services commenced in the tan loft on December 12th. Initially, there was a sense of anticlimax. Only 12 from the community were in attendance, and most of them were older ladies. Yet they persevered with 3 services each Sabbath until Mr. William Tasker, a particularly gifted and coveted Free Church student, responded to Chalmers' personal invitation to serve as the congregation's missionary and eventual minister. Tasker began in April of 1845 and immediately joined Chalmers' side at the head of the Westport experiment. The two became close comrades in arms, and Chalmers found himself enthused once again to be among the working class. As time progressed, there were most encouraging signs of success. Within a year, the number of day school students had nearly quadrupled to 250. By March of 1846, the Sabbath schools had increased to 150 students. On August 6, 1845, the Westport Local Society held a public exhibition in the tannery for a number of prominent Edinburgh citizens, where they toured the facilities and enjoyed a display of the children's academic proficiency. Stuart Brown, his modern biographer, writes, quote, "The day went beautifully. The children performed well, And afterwards, Chalmers joined them for strawberries and cream, a look of benign contentment upon his face as he sat amid the noise and confusion of the excited youngsters, end quote. Hugh Miller wrote in The Witness the following week, quote, "Smile as one might, there is no mistaking the fact that the minds of these children, which, save for this school, would in all probability have slept on for life, were fully awakened," end quote. And in spiritual terms, things were brightening as well. By November of 1845, William Tasker reported that in one section comprising 27 families, 22 of which had lived without any church connection, church attendance at their services sharply increased to 7 families, approaching a third of that population. And yet a still more, quote, gladdening index of success follows, as Tasker reported, quote, that of these 32 individuals, there were a number who give evidence that they have been born again and are now, upon the strength of that conviction, in communion with the visible church and living epistles of Christ, giving light in the darkness. Beside these 7 families, there are 6 or 7 occasional hearers, giving good reason to hope that they will by and by become regular attendants. Thus, 1/2 of the moral desert here has been made to blossom. Fruit, we trust, well pleasing to God is brought forth, and, reasoning from analogy, the remaining half will not be so difficult, seeing that coadjutors in such a goodly proportion are now raised up in the midst of themselves, end quote. In January of 1846, Chalmers began fundraising in earnest for a building that would adequately accommodate the congregation, school, and other social programs already underway. The building would be a kind of multi-purpose facility, the fountainhead of ministry to the community and its social center of gravity. Finally, on Friday, February 19th, 1847, the completed building was opened for its first service of worship. He wrote to Tasker that next Monday, quote, "I have now got the desire of my heart. The church is finished, the schools are flourishing, our ecclesiastical machinery is about complete and all in good working order. God has indeed heard my prayer, and I could now lay down my head in peace and die," end quote. On April 25th, the church observed its first communion. It was 2 days later when he wrote to James Lennox about this most joyful event of his life. Quote, "Our church was opened on the 19th of February, and in 1 month, my anxieties respecting an attendance have been set at rest. 5/6 of the sittings have been let, but the best part of it is that 3/4 of these are from the West Port, a locality which 2 years ago had not 1 in 10 churchgoers from the whole population. I presided myself on Sabbath last over its first sacrament. There were 132 communicants and 100 of them from the West Port," end quote. Chalmers felt vindicated, but what is more, he was completely satisfied, for as he saw it, the Kilmany ideal had been transplanted into the worst moral desert of Edinburgh's slums. As he had anticipated, the Westport experiment was indeed Chalmers' last great tribute to the parish ideal. The very next month, on May 31st, 1847, he was found in bed, having passed in his sleep, his face showing signs only of complacency and peace. A nation forever changed mourned the passing of their loyal son. Now, how did Chalmers advocate his territorial model? What was it that had so captured Chalmers' imagination? We'll focus now mainly on the public lectures that he gave in 1844 to drum up interest in his great final project. It should be conceded that contemporary scholarship offers various interpretations of his territorial model, most of which do helpfully situate and explain it in various ways. But we must not neglect what he himself deemed its foremost purpose: evangelism. Quote, "I ought not to speak of it as an innovation, for it is the precious system of the old time, though it has been grievously departed from. Let me call it now a great home mission, for it is, to all intents and purposes, a missionary enterprise. There are a number of people who will not encourage the work unless it is a work across the ocean or over vast continents. But let me remind you that though the distance of the heathen be in this case but half a mile from your own doors, yet, morally speaking, it is as great as if they lived in the wilds of Tartary or in the South Sea Islands." End quote. Chalmers had long been passionate about foreign missions. He personally trained many missionaries at the University of St. Andrews and later at the University of Edinburgh, inspiring them with his zeal. Yet all along, he was tireless about the cause of missions right on the Scottish doorstep. The proximity of lost sinners living within a Christian land can easily beguile. In reality, an abundance of churches among them matters nothing if the people themselves are spiritually alienated from the things of God. For Chalmers, such was the case with the lower classes in Britain. Consequently, only an explicitly missionary effort could overcome the great moral distance, as he would say, of the home heathen. Quote, "You must go to them and perform essentially the work of a missionary. The object of the local, territorial system is a series of missionary operations." End quote. Its paramount concern was, quote, "the saving of the souls of a district," end quote. Chalmers has frequently been quoted, even among secular academics, quote, "I should count the salvation of a single soul more important than the rescue of a whole empire from pauperism." Such hyperbole could mislead, for the missionary nature of Chalmers' territorial method cannot simply be reduced to the salvation of souls. In the first case, there was the socio-ecclesiastical dimension. Since the habit of church-going among the target population had bottomed out, the immediate aim of the missionary enterprise was to restore that habit. Reflecting a reformed view of salvation and the means of grace, this method endeavored to recruit hearers, such as would be in a way of salvation through a regular attendance on the preaching of the gospel. Quote, "Then let all our teaching and all our testimony be on the side of church going. Let it be our great endeavor to bring them to the habit of submitting themselves Sabbath after Sabbath to attendance on the services of a Christian minister." End quote. To be sure, this made it a species of paternalist social reform, an attempt to civilize a population. But it was viewed as a necessary means to the end of personal salvation. Then there was the socio-economic aspect of the mission. Chalmers advocated the territorial method especially for the benefit of Britain's impoverished masses who had been cruelly neglected by their betters. Fast on the heels of their spiritual well-being came their moral and physical well-being. So such an endeavor should seek to ameliorate their wretchedness. Even if the mission should fall short in conversions, he contended, yet the byproduct of the religious efforts would invariably elevate their outward condition. In purely sociological terms, religion moralizes, and morality pays. Even the collateral benefit of a single conversion is far-reaching. Quote, "Give me a real spiritual convert, one it may be out of 50, and though not one more of the 50 be savingly converted but himself, yet his example has a certain reflex influence on the neighborhood in which he lives. and has the effect of elevating the general standard of morals in that neighborhood. Christians are the salt of the earth. Salt bears but a small proportion to the thing which it preserves, and in like manner, a pure and healthy Christianity sheds an influence on more than those who have believed in it to the salvation of their souls. End quote. Having then treated the design of the territorial method, we now turn to its two cardinal principles, locality and aggression. The local system, embodying the first of the two, stands opposite to the general system. The latter system offers its services indiscriminately to a general population lying at all points of the compass. Whoever likes may avail himself of the church. But the local system operates with a very specific remit, a geographically defined neighborhood. While not excluding any coming from afar, the church operating on the local system gives preference to those within that particular district. Clearly, Chalmers was pushing for the return of ecclesiastical domains, a kind of parish system for the modern age. The second governing principle is aggression. The general system contravenes this, proceeding instead upon the principle of attraction. It aims to attract whomever from wherever by the force of its minister's eloquence. Its fatal flaw, however, is that it only attracts those with a, quote, predisposition for Christian instruction, end quote. In other words, it only attracts those who are already Christians. Such a preacher, quote, with great powers of oratory, eloquence, and impressive preaching, end quote, draws many and packs his church. But with whom, Chalmers queries? Quote, with the people who were formerly attending other churches so that he fills his church at the expense of previous congregations. There is no increase of church goers in this process. There is no creation of new worshipers. It is mere transference of the old worshipers to a new place of worship, end quote. The general system then is not only an exercise in futility, it is irresponsible. It fosters a schismatic jockeying over the same pool of Christians, and even more damning, tends to, quote, float over the mass of practical heathenism beneath them, end quote. The local system, on the other hand, works on the conviction that the masses have no natural predisposition for Christianity. They had lapsed into an, quote, inert, lethargic, sluggish carelessness to the importance of spiritual things, end quote. Such was their natural bent, for it was the natural bent of mankind. Clearly, Chalmers here held the line of strict Calvinist orthodoxy. Because this population was impervious to mere attraction, it must aggressively be pursued. Chalmers was wholly supportive of laissez-faire in economics, but not at all in religion. While there was always a natural demand in the marketplace for the necessities of the body, not so with the necessities for the soul. Such a demand, then, must be created. These two principles merge to form the territorial system. When applied, it means, in the first case, adopting a particular locality. A minister working on this system chalks out de novo a modest-sized urban district of contiguous households to win souls and build a Christian community. It is his own manageable territorial vineyard. He must endeavor to fill his church not with anyone from anywhere, but with these. And because he cannot expect them to darken the doors of the church otherwise, he must, with his elders, aggressively ply them at their doorsteps and in their homes by routine household visits. They must overcome their spiritual lethargy and create a demand where none exists. Ever practical, Chalmers touted his method's many benefits. Foremost is its efficiency. Even a well-intentioned minister on the general system finds that he simply has no time to reach out to the unchurched, since he feels that he must favor his regular hearers in pastoral visitations. As he travels to all points of the city to visit his little diaspora, the unchurched fall through the cracks. On Chalmers' system, however, the physician of souls has but to do with one modest neighborhood, his pastoral and evangelistic spheres being coterminous. Moving from door to door, he pastors any who are believers there, evangelizes and recruits hearers, and gradually transforms a mission field into a Christian community, a microcosm of Christendom. Again, Chalmers was thus unashamedly endeavoring to rehabilitate or perhaps recreate the parish system, quote, the precious system of the olden time, end quote, in which every minister was simultaneously pastor and missionary. The method also capitalizes on the power of moral influence. Now, as we have seen already, the very doctrinal keystone of Chalmers' model was the stern Calvinist doctrine of human depravity. Attraction might work if men were only half bad, but because they are altogether bad, spiritually speaking, there must be aggression. Yet, perhaps surprisingly, the aggression must be winsome. The laborer must go among the people and ingratiate himself in their affections by his manifest care for them, body and soul, parents and children. Quote, he is to watch every opportunity to go to them, especially at those seasons when, through sickness or death in their houses, their hearts are peculiarly open and susceptible to impressions from one who comes to them in the character of a friend and comforter, as interesting himself in the education of their families, and by 1,000 nameless offices and topics of introduction by which you may make a pretext or a real occasion of visiting them. And you will infallibly, in 99 cases out of the 100, meet with a cordial welcome from this alienated population. End quote. This aggression is the force of moral suasion, or as he wrote elsewhere, the omnipotence of Christian charity. That the people are thus susceptible highlights Chalmers' convictions of a certain abiding goodness in human nature, we might say common grace, which the territorial method exploits. Even among the most degraded, quote, it is an invariable law of nature that love begets love. It may not always result in conversion, but it should very well restore a population to regular church attendance, a more hopeful prelude to conversion. Related, the method harnesses the power of sympathy, or the gregarious principle. Not only is it a much more efficient use of the pastor's time to visit contiguous households, but the physical proximity of his parishioners also offers potential for the power of natural human sympathy to augment the pastor's moral suasion. Speaking of the influence of neighborhood, he writes, imagine if, quote, one family is persuaded to go to a well-known church to hear a minister who is also well-known in the neighborhood. If one family thus gives in, it furnishes a common topic of talk to all the neighborhood. Sympathy is excited, for there is much sympathy in the mere fact of juxtaposition. There can be no sympathy between hearers who are half a mile distant from each other, but there is much sympathy among next-door neighbors. This brings the gregarious principle into play. What people will not do singly, they do with delight and readiness in a flock. End quote. Juxtaposition is ready kindling for the flame of sympathy to spread. The general system quite misses this opportunity with its non-local approach to visitation. How exactly then would the method work? Chalmers gave his listeners several lines of advice. They should begin visiting the households throughout their adopted district. They should familiarize themselves with its inhabitants, gleaning information from them, especially whether they attend a church and their children a school. Let the statistics be recorded. Reconnaissance is crucial, and they should return again and again, making such visits routine. Nor should the laborer be daunted by the greatness of the responsibility. Little and often can carry the day, said Chalmers. Quote, I have, as I have often said, great faith in the accumulation of littles, end quote. Should the district not yet have a church or a school, the associations should seek to raise the required funds and build them. In the meantime, a preaching station should be secured. As we have already considered before, the visitors should ply them with moral suasion. If welcomed in, they should aim to speak, quote, forcibly and familiarly to them in their own houses. They should especially urge them to the practice of church going, using, quote, affectionate invitations and remonstrances. Other tactics would help ingratiate them into the hearts of the people. They should pay attention to the children, showing genuine care and concern. If they are in school, the visitor might inquire into their proficiency and even have them display their attainments then and there. He might also give books as constructive rewards. He should visit the sick and comfort the mourning. To that end, he should keep his ear to the ground, ever on the lookout for such tender moments of doing good and winning hearts. While he should not indiscriminately give out money, he might pay for such necessities as medical care or medicines. Further, benevolent funds would best be used not for handouts, but mainly for the erection and maintenance of churches, schools, and other beneficial institutions, education, and nobles. And it is never degrading to contribute to or underwrite medical care. To be sure, Jesus fed the crowds twice, but he healed each and every one who came to him throughout his ministry. Chalmers made much of this contrast. When Jesus, quote, saw the sordid expectations of the people, did he then bring them food by miracle? No. He said, verily, verily, ye seek me, not because ye saw the miracle, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. And he put them off with a spiritual advice, labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that which endures to everlasting life. So he treated the case of hunger. Now take the case of disease. He never sent away the applications of the diseased. Petitions were brought to him from the maimed, the halt, the lame, and the blind. And it is said repeatedly that he looked with compassion upon them and healed them all. End quote. Thus, Christ left us this example to shape our philanthropy. Prioritize the spiritual and lavishly care for the temporal needs of the poor in ways that will not degrade them. Now, lest Chalmers be thought to approach evangelism in a mechanistic way, he made it clear that the territorial method was no fail-safe recipe. The Spirit of God must bless the work. Earnest prayer must accompany the labor throughout. That being said, a quietistic indifference to method and effort is equally wrong. There must be a middle way. Quote, it is in some respects like a steam engine. It is not a matter of indifference what kind of steam engine we employ. One steam engine will do its work better than another, but in all of them, the moving force is indispensable. A steam engine, however perfect, is useless if it have not a moving force. But then that does not supersede the question as to the best kind of steam engine. End quote. More than 150 years has passed since the Westport experiment began at the close of Thomas Chalmers' career. Western society has only accelerated further from the days in which the old parish model flourished. social, demographic, and technological changes have remade the landscape. And what is more, ours is a secularizing, if not a wholly secularized Christendom. Arguably, it isn't even a Christendom anymore, which would seem to make it all the more an inhospitable environment for such Chalmers-style experiments. But those sharing his viewpoint would contend that human nature has not changed, nor has the spiritual plight of modern man. And if today's Westerner still assumes an embodied existence, takes up space, residing in some locality, and if he is still susceptible to the moral suasion of someone who will care for his soul, then territorial experiments are yet worth attempting, or at least dreaming and praying for. Now that's the talk, gentlemen, and I've also been asked to share just a little bit about what I have done in Rhode Island. I hardly suggest that what I've done is perfect in any way, but I'm going to share the screen and at least give a few images. I would share more, but as this is a general broadcast, I don't want to reveal personal images of the various ones that I would normally share in a more closed circuit situation. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, when I came to Rhode Island about 14, 15 years back, inherited basically a small congregation of how I would describe them as first generation Reform folk, of whom I am one. I was raised Pentecostal, most of everyone else not familiar with Reformed, much less Scottish Presbyterian doctrine, practice, government, these kinds of things. Now, when I came to pastor here, I had already been bit by the Chalmers bug, and I was looking for an opportunity as one component, not the only, but one component of outreach is to adopt a district and to go door to door, treat it like my own, get to know the folks there, win them, if not to the gospel, win them to church, at least getting them in the doors. And so I've been doing that for about, as many years as I've been here. This is where we worship. It's not the geographic center really of anything other than a convenient place for us to worship. We all have to drive to church. We still do. But I was kind of at a crossroads when I came to Rhode Island. How can I implement this? So I started doing it nearby where I lived. This is very near where I lived at the time. We used this hall for special evangelistic meetings. But I had this pull for a long time to bring the gospel, and especially the richness of the confessionally Presbyterian Reformed faith, to bring that to a lot of people who would never have experienced it, especially working class, different ethnicities. For a long time, I've had interest in Hispanic outreach. There are a lot of those types in the United States. So I tried Providence, which was not even 10 minutes from my doorstep to the north, which is a multi-ethnic working class community. And I was not disappointed at all. I had longer doorstep conversations, more meaningful, more frequent. And I also experienced something I never experienced dealing with people of my own demographic and socioeconomic status. I was actually invited into their homes and given a cup of coffee. And so I'm sitting down reading the Bible, even in my broken Spanish, with a little, nominally Roman Catholic old lady. And there were other ones similar to that. So I was won over by this, very encouraged. Again, it's not the only outreach that we engage in. I try to be engaging of whoever the Lord places into our lives. But this is this particular district in South Providence, and Yeah, it's not much to look at, but for me, when I look at these pictures, these buildings, so many of these buildings have stories connected with them. For example, the one that's just on your right side of the screen, you see just a little bit of it. At the top level is a fellow. I'll just say his name's Eric. That's not his real name. He's a heathen, a total heathen, but he's let me come into his house. He's an African American fellow. I just visited with his common law wife about 3 weeks back, just going door to door. They've never been to church yet, but we're working on that and praying that God will bless it. So yeah, that's just a little vignette into what I've done, and I'll stop the sharing and turn things over to our host. Hopefully I didn't go too long.
Right.